Welcome, everyone. My name's Alex Taylor. I'm from the University of Edinburgh. I'm a reader in design informatics. And I'll introduce you to our panel in a moment. I just want to say how we got here as a group. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about my own background to give you some sense of how someone gets to the point that they're standing here giving you an off-key note, and I'll explain why we've called it that too. And then what we're going to do is we're each going to take 15 minutes where we've put some prompts up on the screen that relate to our work and our orientation to our work. Each of us have written these prompts, and we purposefully want you to see them and get a sense of the kinds of questions that we might ask ourselves when we conduct our research and when we engage with researchers and students, etc. For me, it's about exposing my own practice as a researcher and my own thinking. The other side of this is we want you to engage in this discussion, and that's why it's called an off-key note. We want you to be participants in the conversation with us. So we are going to try and do that. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. We'll see how it goes. But Ruth, we've already done an amazing job today, and Ros has really set it up nicely for us to be having conversations, and you've already engaged with conversations. So if we can carry on that kind of tone, although it's quite a formal space, it would be great to have you engage with us in that way. So how did I get here and how did we get here? So Dan, who some of you have met already and who's going to be sort of leading things tomorrow, approached me. We've had interactions in the past to ask if I wanted to be the keynote speaker. And increasingly, I've got to the stage in my career where I don't want to be a keynote speaker. I don't want to be standing up here telling you what digital good is, because my version of digital good, has no more authority than yours, and in fact probably has less, because you've probably been spending more time thinking about that, at least recently. So immediately I said to Dan, look, can we do something different where we engage people and have more of a conversation about that? And of course, Dan and the Digital Good Network were amazing. And we're like, yeah, whatever works. And so we put this amazing panel together, Violet, Ben, Ros, and I didn't realize at the time that Ros was doing everything else today. So I feel bad that we got her to be involved, but she's going to obviously do an excellent job. So I wanted this to be a conversation between us, but also with you, and to sort of ask the questions that you've already been asking yourselves today, which is what constitutes the good in digital good? And that, of course, is a serious question. It's a non-trivial question that I'm sure you ponder on in your own work all the time, and hence why this should be a conversation. So that's the sort of background of how we got here. I am, as I've said, sort of increasingly as an academic who has been around for probably too long, I don't want to be taking center stage. That should be for everyone, and that is also my practice. I have been trying to find ways, probably for the last, 4 to 5 years in my career, of just bringing more people to the table. And I do that both in my own research, but also in my practice as an academic. And so thank you for the opportunity, Dan, to do that. So my background is in sociology. I did my PhD in the sociology of technology. I studied mobile phones in teenagers when this was first sort of unfolding, and no one expected it. My co-sponsors for my PhD were the mobile phone operators. I was doing at the time what was quite innovative, but some of you are already involved in this now, which was a co-sponsored PhD between the ESRC, the Social Science Research Council, and a collection of mobile phone operators. So at the time, there's something like Orange, I can't even, T-Mobile, etc. Some of them are no longer in existence. And they sort of gave me the opportunity to pick my field site. And I said I wanted to study teenagers, and they just were baffled by this, that, you know, what have teenagers got to do with a business device? And of course, teenagers had everything to do with this new device. They weren't smartphones, they were what we now call Nokia phones, and they largely were Nokia phones. And what I came to appreciate at the time was that these devices were being used to build social networks. And this was before social networks as we know them today. This was groups of people strengthening their relations through some form of technological mediation. The thing that I really focused on is SMS. And some of you may not even know what that acronym is. I don't know. Does anyone not know what SMS is? Okay, so you've heard of it, but you're all sort of digitally aware, as it were. But I do speak to some audiences, especially early undergraduates, and they just look at me quizzically like SMS. So of course, SMS was a technological infrastructure that was designed for engineers to communicate with each other, quite often using their computers. It wasn't built for phones. And you know, as history has taught us, these things then, of course, get appropriated in unexpected ways. The lens, if you like, that I took in my PhD was very much a structural sociology, looking at practices of gift exchange. I used Durkheim and Mauss as my sort of central figures thinking about gift exchange. I look at that now and sort of, you know, I'm sure many of you already start to look back at some of the things you've written and sort of are a little bit shocked and unsure about what you've written. But I did think it helped me understand how a sociological theory can be brought to bear on understanding a cultural practice. And these ideas of gift exchange and even sort of the potlatch, which Mauss writes about, how it brings together and solidifies and cements community, but also ostracizes people, still ring true today with my young kids, and I see them using phones and have to grapple not only with the sort of what might be seen as the strengths of mobile technologies, but also the risks and dangers that come with them. And, you know, I certainly live in a contemporary moment where I worry a lot about the way in which my kids use their phones. But you know, we had no insight or foresight of that at the time. It was very much sort of making sense of how technologies are being taken up by a youth culture, and that took us by surprise. So that's sort of a little bit of the background to my own PhD work. Since then, I was doing a postdoc at the University of Surrey and looking at medical records, again, through a sociological frame. And I met some people at Microsoft who were based in Redmond, and they were just starting to get a sense of ethnography and design and how those things kind of spoke to one another. So again, this was quite early days. Some of you will have already encountered how ethnography is being taken up by the tech sector. But at the time, you know, this was very much a new thing. And so they liked the kind of work that I had done for my PhD, and they said, well, do you want to come and work for us? And I really didn't imagine myself working for a company like Microsoft. It just wasn't on my sort of plan for being an academic. So I gave them a sort of ludicrous offer that I would work for them under a set of amazing conditions, thinking that they would never accept them. One of them being sort of unfettered global access and travel to do anthropological work with young people. And they came back in a week and said, okay, you can do it, and we'll pay you to do it. You don't have to write research grants, and we'll hire you as a full-time researcher. So I was very lucky. They didn't really know what they were getting, and they didn't really understand what ethnography was. So I was very lucky at that moment to just sort of be able to tell them, well, this is what ethnographers do. So I ended up working for Microsoft for 13 years as a researcher. At that time, various tech companies, the way I see it now is they go through their sort of ebbs and flows, and for probably 10 years of that period, I could kind of do what I wanted. I always had these sort of running jokes with other corporate researchers and some friends at Intel, and I used to sort of talk about, well, how long could you get away with doing nothing for? And at Intel, they would say, well, maybe 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks. And my sort of reaction was always, well, probably about 2 years, because no one ever seemed to ask me what I was doing. And so I sort of made it up as I was going along. So I studied all sorts of technologically mediated environments, from smart homes to smart cities, to machine intelligence and AI. And I was always interested in how computation was a sort of infrastructure to our everyday experiences. So infrastructurally in terms of a social structure, but infrastructurally, of course, also as a computational architecture. And it's that orientation that I continue being interested in today. So what I aim to do, what I seek to do, is ask critical questions about the way in which technology shapes social life. And just as the Digital Good Network is seeking to do, I also aim to imagine other possibilities. And so one of the core readings that I engaged with as a PhD student was Donna Haraway in her various guises. And when I first read it, I just didn't know what to make of it. I was just, it was like when my first exposure as an undergraduate to postmodernity, and it just blew everything away, and I sort of got lost for a year and sort of thinking about how everything was a discourse. Likewise, Haraway was the same, was just, this idea that you might use the cyborg as a technological imaginary was just so eye-opening to me. And I think that is really at the core of what I see as being the potential for a technological imaginary, that we can take something like the cyborg that had already been cast as a kind of intensely male figure that drove a technological narrative about the future, and sort of turn it inside out and think very differently about what technology might enable for us and what lives technology might make possible for us, that, if you like, set against sort of contemporary and dominant narratives and heteronormative narratives. So I implore you to read and to engage with these texts and to not worry about getting kind of frightened and worried by them. They can be difficult, but to stay with the trouble, as Haraway likes to invite us to do. So that's a little bit of the background. This is who we have today on our panel. Hopefully you can all see that. So obviously it's myself. As I said, I'm based at the University of Edinburgh. Ros, who you've met, Violet, who is a PhD student at Lancaster, but is also doing, you're also doing a postdoc as well, yes, which is incredible that you can combine those things. And Violet's going to talk a little bit about her work on sustainability, but also invite questions about evaluation. And then Ben, who is a colleague of mine in science and technology studies and criminology, and he's going to talk about, he's been doing some really incredible work across a range of field sites, but he's going to talk largely about his methods, because they are inventive methods. And I'm not sure if you've come across the term inventive methods, but make a note of that and do some searching around that, because some lovely work around that too. So that's who we have today. So the other thing I just want to let you know about is most of you have probably used Miro. We have a Miro board running in parallel to the talk today. This is one channel that you can use to communicate with each other, but also with us. So we'll try and keep an eye on this Miro board as we progress through the next hour or so. And so if you've got words, questions, prompts, tags, whatever, just try and put them into this space. There's sort of I've used 3 boxes: the goods, the bads, and the in-betweens. And if you've got things that might fall outside the boxes, put them outside the box, just so we get a sense of the kinds of themes that are grabbing your attention. I know there's also a remote audience, and we invite the remote audience to also use the Miro board to communicate with us as well. So that's the setup. And we're going to start with Ros, who's going to talk us through her prompts.
Thanks, Alex. So I'm going to hold this mic. I've also got a little iPad to keep an eye on some notes that I wrote for today. Yes, so Alex asked me to join, and yes, I also have a range of other responsibilities, but I just like talking about this sort of stuff. So I thought I'd take the opportunity to sit up here and waffle on some more, but hopefully in a meaningful way that you guys can get something out of, and hopefully I can get something back from you all as well. Just as an incidental, I'd never heard of Miro board before I met Dan Richards. And now I feel like I spend my entire life with people on with these little cursors around me, sort of all the visiting Mironeers around me. So it will be exciting to see you guys filling that out as we go along. Just to give a bit of context on me then. So I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Sociological Studies at the University of Sheffield here in this very building. I got my promotion just maybe 18 months ago. Until then, I was a lecturer. I'd been a lecturer for 3 years. Before that, I was a postdoc. It was like a pretty much running parallel to that lectureship. It was a 3-year postdoc that fell out of a couple of RA posts. Before that, a teaching fellowship, and then before that, a PhD. So it wasn't actually that long ago. I finished my PhD in 2016. Defended it in the December of 2015. I got my first teaching fellowship right at the end of my PhD. It was a very, very stressful time when I was writing and also teaching a lot. And I don't think about that time too fondly. I break out into a bit of a cold sweat on when I think about it. But I think it's worth flagging that the different routes that we take. Oh my gosh, what a dreamy set of situations you found yourself in. All of the stories and the pathways that we take are very, very different from one another. And I don't think we can say that enough, because we do fetishize a particular pathway. Violet's even doing a postdoc before even being postdoc. So, you know, it demonstrates all the different ways that we can have successful careers within and beyond universities. So I'm a sociologist. I'm a sociologist of health and illness and a sociologist of race and ethnicity. The digital technologies doesn't really come up until about 5 years ago, and I started kind of dabbling around the edges of that because it was coming up in things I was looking at elsewhere. And I've always had a background in science and technology studies because that really was what my PhD was in at the University of York. And throughout my training, both as a sociologist of health and illness and of race and ethnicity, I was trained to be a critical social scientist. And to me, the idea of critique was about taking something apart, not necessarily constructing something in its stead. That was always sort of how I understood it. So my papers, when I would write them, would sort of like end with the problem. I'd be like, right, look at this problem I've identified. The end. Okay. And then I'd move on to a new thing, and I'd write this thing, and there'd be a problem, and then it would be the end of that as well. So I thought what I'd do is I'd talk a little bit about this idea of what it means to center equity in digital societies research. This is the first kind of prompt that makes me think about this. And the point for me is that in the time I've been working in the Digital Good Network and learning from colleagues, including folks here on the stage and amongst you, is the idea that equity and inequity are both important things to look at. But I feel like for much of my career, I've been focused on inequity and locating things that are inequitable, that are unfair, not necessarily reflecting on how we might redress that inequity. And I sometimes like to think about that as a kind of a lens. And I mentioned Ruha Benjamin earlier, but it's because she's a bit of a totem for me, because I love all of her books. And in Viral Justice, she says that we do not need any more studies that demonstrate that racism exists. And I was like, this is a fair point, Ruha Benjamin. She's not the only person who said that. Many people have made that point, and yet continually publications are rendered that say, look at this bit of racial inequality, look at this bit of racism over here, look, more evidence yet of racism. And although that work is very, very important, we might think about it as an inequalities or an inequities lens, right? So it renders a kind of a judgment of a situation without necessarily offering a sense of how we might step forward beyond that. So I thought what I would try and do is offer a bit of a short story about a paper I wrote, first of all, and its afterlife. Thinking here with Susan Lee Starr's motto, which he borrows from Cicero, the old lawyer, a couple of millennia old lawyer, cui bono, can't speak Latin, don't know if that's how you say it, CUI space BONO, who benefits? That is the point that she makes, right? So who benefits from a technology, okay? And I think that's a really important starting point, but it's not an ending point. It's who benefits, but also how might we expand the breadth of beneficiaries of a given technology. So in this paper that I wrote about, it was about people who use social media to try and locate donors for their transplants when they need a stem cell transplant, right? They've got blood cancer and they cannot find a matching transplant. So who here has heard of a stem cell donor registry? Put your hand in the air. It's like bone marrow registry is another term of it. Can you put it up if you've heard of that before? Bone marrow registry. Okay, then. Can I ask somebody, pick on somebody? Let's go, Jake. How have you heard of a bone marrow registry before?
I'm on it.
You're on it. How did you become to be on the registry, Jake?
Blood donation centre, they gave me a leaflet and they asked me whether I wanted to be on it or not to be there.
Right. So Jake, sorry, there should be a microphone coming around when people have things to say, but Jake, do you want to repeat that? Sorry, for folks online.
Yeah, sorry. So I heard of the registry through the blood donation centre after they gave me, after the donation, they informed me and gave me a leaflet to it and directed me whether I wanted to do it or not.
Absolutely. So a lot of these different systems rely on letting you know that they exist in the first place. And they use all kinds of technologies to do it. Some of it's very like, kind of quotidian, like a leaflet. Increasingly, that has moved online through the use of everything from paid advertising on social media, all the way through to mobilizing people telling stories on social media about the fact that they can't find a stem cell transplant. I was really interested in the fact that if you go on the news at any given time, in the last, let's say, every 6 months or so, something will pop up in the news where someone's looking for a stem cell transplant and they cannot find a match. I was like, this is a very strange thing. People are going online, they're telling everybody that they're really, really ill, potentially about to die from cancer if they cannot find a stem cell match. The other thing I noticed about all of these people was that invariably they were racially minoritized in some way. Dig into the story a little bit more and you find out that a bunch of the people who require stem cell transplants but can't find them are racially minoritized because of an underrepresentation of those kinds of donors on the registry. So there was all sorts of stuff going on here, and I was really intrigued to know about why people would tell this kind of story online. So I spoke to a bunch of these folks about why it is they tell these stories online. Why would you think about going on the internet to tell everybody how ill you are and how desperate you are to locate a match for you? And the people I spoke to said, I didn't really have much of a choice, right? Social media is the route now which people do these sorts of things. I'm going to have to do it too. And sure enough, they go through lots of effort to do this. They were generating tons of content, generating absolutely tons of it, right? So pictures of themselves in hospital, taking their drugs, having a biopsy, all of these things, they were putting them online, right? Just to generate more views and more clicks for their content, pushing them further up the algorithm on Facebook so that they would be seen. And they were talking about how much work it was to do that, how tiring it was whilst they were ill. And then they were also talking about the fact that they would sooner not do it. Obviously, if any of us got ill, God forbid, from cancer or otherwise, the last thing you want to do is tell everybody about it. You want to be at home with your family, kind of healing, recuperating, waiting for a treatment to begin. You do not want to be on the internet telling everybody how ill you are and how desperate you are for their help, right? So they were exhausted by all of this work. And worse still was the fact that once you do something like that online, what happens to that material once it's online? Anyone? It goes public, and does it ever go away? No, it's there forever. It's there in perpetuity. Well, we're realists here. The material, for as long as the material infrastructure exists, that information will be out there. So I spoke to people and they were like, if you search my name, there are about 10 results with the Daily Mail articles of where I've gone through various processes of leukemia treatment. And then on the second page, you find my LinkedIn profile. But all of this stuff from 3 years ago when I was ill is at the top. So I was like, this is very, very interesting that all of these people are going through this horrible process of running patient appeals to find donors for themselves on social media. So I published this paper and they said, look how awful all of these things are. Look at these terrible things these people have to do. It's really, really difficult. And maybe we should reconsider the role of the patient appeal. Critique complete. On with my life. Right. 2 years later, I get an email from the Canadian Blood Service who say, actually, we use patient appeals quite a lot. Your paper was eye-opening. We'd not thought about this before. But we're not going to stop doing patient appeals. However, we would like to know how to do them better. right? So for over the last 6 months, I've been trying to plan a new project with these guys where we try to think about how they can do this kind of stuff whilst thinking about how they can engage people's stories, their pictures and so on ethically in a way that brings justice to those people, that makes them feel seen, but also doesn't expose them in a way that currently they feel exposed through that practice, right? The story sort of ends there because we're at the stage where we're designing a project that might actually do that. But I must say, before the Digital Good Network, if they had emailed me, I would have shuddered in my boots. It would have taken a long time to reply. And I think I probably would have been reluctant to engage with that because I was like, I'm a sociologist. I'm not here to tell you how to fix things. I'm just telling you how broken they are in the first place. So that basically gives you a sense of how I moved from, or I'm moving from, what I would describe an inequities lens towards thinking about how we can generate the practice of technology, the use of technology in ways that are actually more equitable. It is a very uncomfortable disposition for someone like me. It is far more comfortable for others, I think, in the room to do that. I was never trained to do that. At the time I was doing my PhD, impact was not something that really was spoken about. It's only in the last 5 or so years that now we expect our PhD students to be thinking about impact and engagement beyond the university context. But we ask the world of a PhD now in a way we absolutely did not when I was doing one. And so I come to this moment now very unequipped in how to deal with it. So I have to reach beyond myself, right, to colleagues who are doing this work far more regularly, trained impact, knowledge exchange kind of folks, right? So this is the idea here of moving from inequity toward equity. So moving just beyond the critical engagement with something to opening up a more generative conversation about what the alternative might actually be. And I think that's a really, really important starting point for us when we're thinking about the digital good in relation to our own research. And hearing some of you guys today, for those online, this keynote is part of the Digital Good Network Summer School. Been hearing about absolutely fantastic work that the PhD students here are doing, where they're already thinking about this question. They're like, obviously you don't just criticize something and tear it apart. It would be irresponsible not to offer an alternative and help to participate in bringing that alternative into being. Obviously, that is not where I was at when I was doing my PhD, and I think it's fair enough that I admit that. So in that context, right, that is a kind of me doing my research, right? How do we start to center equity in the research that we do? But there's also another question that underpins all of this, which isn't just the research, it's also the research environment. And this is something that increasingly has become a passion and an interest of mine, actually sort of transcending my interest in doing research myself. I'm very much interested in how we generate a space for people who, frankly, are much better at doing research than I am, to be able to go out and do that research well. So I'm keen to be part of thinking about how we generate environments that actually generate a space in which lots of different people can do research on lots of different things in sustainable and fair ways. And I thought what I'd do just to think about this in terms of how we center equity in our research environments, not just in our research, will be to talk just a little bit, if I may, about the Digital Good Network, which is why all of you guys are here. Someone said to me today, I'm sorry, I can't remember who, it has been a long day. They said, I can't believe there are 30 students here. And I was like, well, yeah, obviously, we're going to pay. And they said, oh, it's a funded PhD summer school. I thought there'd be 10 people. Like, no, we spend the money on the things that actually bring people together and that people will derive value from. And that is what the purpose of our network is to distribute funds in ways that help to generate a research environment in which people hopefully can thrive and think about how they can develop their research in interesting sorts of ways. So the Digital Good Network is at once a research environment itself. So we actually do research in the Digital Good Network. You'll meet Dan and Kim tomorrow, who are doing their own empirical research. But also we are a research funder. So we redistribute funds from the Economic and Social Research Council through the Digital Good Research Fund, which is this mechanism that we've got. And I just wanted to talk just a little bit about the Digital Good Research Fund, because we've got these 3 societal challenges that I spoke to the summer school about earlier: equity, resilience, and sustainability. Okay, so when you apply for the Digital Good Research Fund, you can apply to do research on either equity, resilience, or sustainability. You can do more than one, but you've got to do at least one of those. It's got to relate to one of those 3 themes. So who here thinks that sustainability is the most considered research topic when people are applying for the Digital Good Research Fund? Of all the Digital Good Research Fund topics, is sustainability the one that is most funded by our network? Hands in the air for sustainability. Okay, hands in the air for resilience. Hands high in the air so we can see. Okay, what about equity? Okay, so the equity hands have it. equity is the one that, certainly in the first round, we funded the most of. Because I think social scientists know that equity is obviously, it's a perennial issue, but it's also a very topical issue. People are on board with it, right? So as a research topic, I don't think equity is the issue, but I do think the research environment that we're in is the issue. I think it's a significant issue, right? All of you are going to leave your PhDs. Many of you, sometimes before you finish the PhD, will end up in a postdoc. Is the postdoc going to pay you appropriately for the work that you do? Is it going to give you enough space to develop yourself whilst you're doing empirical research for somebody else as the PI? Are you going to have time to develop your own CV? All of those different things. But when you're doing the research, are you just the dog's body who's going to collect the data? Or are you also going to be paid to go to a conference, right? Are you going to offer some leadership over one of the work packages? Will you participate intellectually in that project? Or will you just be the person who's doing all of the labor so somebody else can take the credit, okay? I hope that it is absolutely the better circumstance for you, but sometimes it remains that it is not. So at the Digital Good Research Fund, one of the criteria that we've embedded into the DGRF is that early career researchers should be properly remunerated. They should be given opportunities for leadership and development within a Digital Good Research Fund. If the person who applies for that can demonstrate it, up go the grades for the grader, right? So all of the reviews will offer a higher grade to people who offer ECR leadership opportunities. Next thing you know, the ones that we're funding are actually, in terms of research environments, that much better for early career researchers. That is a choice that we made in terms of the criteria that we developed when we were putting together the Digital Good Research Fund. It could easily have just been about research excellence. How excellent is this research project? But it was not. We also ensured that everything that we embed is also about equity as well, okay? So I suppose the reason of telling you these two different stories is because equity is something that we need to be thinking about, not only in terms of our own research, but also in terms of our practice as researchers as well. And that's everything from the minutiae of you being a researcher and making sure that your participants are properly remunerated, all the way through to the latter parts of your career, many years from now when you can't imagine it, making sure that you're also being a good researcher and ensuring that the generation coming up beneath you have the opportunities that hopefully you will be afforded as well. So those are just a few little thoughts from me, Alex. I hope that's a good starting point. I will jump over to...
Yeah, Violet, just to say, can someone put equity and research environment in here? Just because also these are notes for me to look back at and see what you're thinking. So just please just throw stuff in there. And Violet, are you good to take? Oh.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So yeah, I'm Violet. I'm from Lancaster University, so I work with Dan and Kim quite a lot. I was really flattered to be asked to be part of this off-keynote session because I feel like I'm not like a prominent expert in digital. I've sort of dipped in and around spaces, and my postdoc's working in IoT. But my background before that was in education. So I worked as a design and technology teacher for roughly a decade before I started my PhD. And then my PhD is focusing on creative evaluation. But I've always had an interest in digital spaces, digital things, technologies. I'm quite nerdy and I love gaming. I bet those conversations have already come up today. But something I've always been quite passionate about is sustainability. And it's something that within my teaching and now within my postdoctoral work is a focus. Something that occurred to me whilst I was engaged in a lot of this work is around terminology we're using. And that's something like I'd like to speak a bit about today, and thinking about actually how do we understand digital sustainability. So much of the products and the systems and the services we use and the terminology we use to describe those things, there's like this disconnect that happens between digital things and the real world. And that has a big impact when we're thinking about sustainability. You've got these terms like the cloud, like data, like digital. And for me, they sort of conjure these like ethereal ideas of what digital is. Like they exist in a different plane, in a different space from the world. So somehow that means that, you know, they're not connected anymore. So when we're considering sustainability, we don't think about necessarily what that means for digital spaces. And there's all these unseen impacts of digital things that we need to consider, particularly when we're conducting research on digital things, whether that's a service, a product, or a place, or a thing. So there's so many different things that we could consider. How many of you, just out of interest, talk about sustainability in your work? Anyone put their hands up? Interesting, so there's a few of you. Would anyone like to share how they talk about sustainability in their work? I'd love to hear. Great, yeah, you get your hand up still, thanks.
Yeah, how I've thought through sustainability through my work, especially more through the frame of stuff like through climate change and stuff like that in particular. Like how it's communicated, but also we could talk about like how it's, talk about through the phrasing of it, of like, say, how climate change is communicated, but in a phrase also like how people talk and understand about sustainability as well. It's kind of like how it frequently comes out, how people interpret it, how they go on to discuss it themselves, kind of that sort of realm of it is why I kind of look into it.
Excellent. So within that, you've mentioned the different ways that people talk about sustainability. Like that's something I'd like to like maybe focus on a little bit as well. But is there anyone else that would also like to share how they talk about sustainability in their work? Yeah.
Yes, when we come back with the very definition of sustainability is this generation use the resources and not impact the next generation. Usability, right? So in my research on transport, they define the sustainable transport system. Mean the transport have to have impact on environment. So they have net zero project to mitigate the impact of transport on environment, and they try to bring more sustainable energy used in transporting. And also transport have impact on the society. So that we see how transport can contribute to the economic development, also well-being of people, but not only the people in general. They more focus on the people in remote area, like undeserved or marginal society, marginal community. So that's why how they define the sustainable, but in the long term of transport system, the expectation in the future, they want to develop a affordable, reliable, and sustainable transport system for everyone.
I think that's so interesting. You've actually covered so many points that I'd like to raise. And I apologize if at any point during your answer I looked distracted. A big spider just ran across the floor. so apologies if I looked distracted momentarily. Yeah, they're really interesting. So you've got big terms there like net zero. You've got terms like social sustainability. You've got marginalized groups. There was points about equability in there. So there's so many different ways that we can think about sustainability. Often in literature, you might come across things like the 3 pillars of sustainability. Has anyone heard of that before? So you've got social sustainability, economic sustainability, and then ecological sustainability. That's quite a useful frame to think about sustainability, but it also kind of highlights how broad when we're talking about sustainability and what that is. And there isn't this general consensus about what sustainability means. Because if we're talking about ecological sustainability, then we might be more focused on environmental perspectives. And lots of my colleagues at Lancaster University, that's something they're really interested in. And if you work in the sort of design spheres, you might come across more than human perspectives, and that often relates to ecological sustainability. You've also got things like social sustainability, and that really relates actually to a lot of things that you've already talked about, Ros, and it's more about the social equitable aspects of how those technological products impact on people. So not just about what's good or bad for the environment, but actually what effect that has on people, which also could relate to how the ecological impacts on people too. So sustainability becomes this really sort of huge, unwieldy space, which I think also is sometimes why we maybe reject it sometimes when we're thinking about digital, because it's like, this is too much, well, you know, we're already considering all of these things. You know, all of you have presented these really interesting PhD projects, and there's so much in that already. And then I'm like, well, just add another layer to this and consider sustainability now, and that's really big. But would anyone like to share as well things that they've considered in their research about sustainability, maybe in the social sphere? Has anyone thought about social sustainability? Or it could be economical sustainability as well. And I know there was a really fantastic presentation earlier about the financial, digital finance, which was really captured me, because finance isn't normally something that I'm super interested in, much to my dad's dismay, being a financial accountant. But that was really interesting. So does anyone else like to share some of their thoughts about what they've done in their work? Thank you.
Hi, I talked about the digital finance thing, and so the thing is that for the smaller firms to really thrive, they have like a limited availability of funds. So to really sustain, like we are seeing factors what are leading them to being acquired by big companies, because they have the technology but they don't have the money. So to sustain in the long run, you really need to give them a space in which they don't have to worry about all these administrative things that they have to do in terms of compliance. So we are looking at it from that point of view, and also we are trying to use like the large language models. So the problem with large language models is that people are concerned about that they produce hallucinations. So if you are trying to meet compliance and then it's hallucinating the rules, that would be a really scary thing to do. So when you try to create a platform which can be used by everyone, you have to make sure that it's reliable. So we are trying to make a platform which would be like which can bring them on a same level playing field with the big firms as well. So that's how we are thinking that let's see how tech can make everyone like play by the same rules, not the big firms being at an advantage because they have like a team of lawyers who can do the compliance all day, but the small firms, they don't have anyone, and then they also have to see that they are not penalized. So that's how we are looking at the angle of like sustaining the smaller firms in finance. Yeah.
And I think that's so interesting. Like, it kind of highlights the diversity, because even within these like 3 short conversations of you talking about your research, you all touch upon very different perspectives on sustainability, but they're all highly relevant, and they're really interconnected in like lots of interesting ways, like the idea of talking about equity. So you've talked about like you've got business sustainability, but you've got like sustainable equity for people who are representing like smaller firms. So I think it's such a fascinating topic that we can think about when we're talking about our digital work. So I suppose like before I move into talking a bit more about evaluation, the sort of takeaways that I'd like you to maybe consider is, you know, when we talk about sustainability, how are we acknowledging those unseen digital spaces and how they impact on the environment, on people, and it can be also on like ecology and finance as well, because obviously we know that has like big implications for our social spaces. So I think that's just something like be really interesting for you to consider in your work. And it might be something that, you know, takes you into a new space or a new dimension of your research. So the next sort of topic I want to talk about is how we evaluate the good in digital good. Now, this also really like linked, I think, well with what Ros was saying. And I was like scribbling some notes when you were talking about the inequality, inequity and equity, and that sort of like really like binary definition between them, and how we often focus more on the negative rather than the positive. And I think that's also really true in evaluation as well. We often focus on like what went wrong and what we need to do better, but actually not how we can capture the value that we've created. So how do we actually approach establishing the good digital practices, and how do we approach capturing the value that we're creating? And this is something I know the DGN has been looking at, and they've been recruiting people and asking for bids and things of projects around evaluation because they're really interested in it. And it also covers things like who needs to be involved in that conversation. And actually, are we au fait with evaluation methods and techniques? Do we know what that means? I mean, in fact, would anyone here like to share a definition of evaluation, like what that means to them, or maybe what that means to their research? And I know a few of you actually mentioned evaluation in your presentation, so it's interesting to see that come up as a theme. But is there anyone that would like to share? And it's okay if not. I don't want to put anyone on the spot. Great, thank you.
Hi, it's absolutely not a definition, it's a shot in the dark. I think I would have thought about it as a kind of qualitative judgment of conformity alongside set values. So I think you can't have an evaluation without ideally an explicit criteria, or at least an implicit criteria. But I guess you would have a certain set of values or judgments, and you would evaluate an object in terms of how well it conforms with those values or criteria.
I think that's a really interesting starting point as well for this discussion. Would anyone else like to add or to build on that at all? Yeah, secondary, thank you.
Yeah, my research is looking at evaluation. I'm evaluating a system that is already existing. When you talk about sustainability, my research talked about that too, from the angle of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal, the 5th one precisely, that talks about gender equality. And then I'm trying to evaluate, like back in my country, you have more men using digitals and all of that. And I'm trying to evaluate what is obtainable, what's existing. Why is it that most women are not using it? For instance, the percentage of women who are digitally inclined in my country is less than 30%, and that is very poor compared to the population. We have over 200 million people in Nigeria, and you're talking about just less than 30 women using digital. So I'm trying to evaluate that system, that what is happening, why is this so? And another thing again, it's there's a particular model I'm using. It's called CIPP evaluation model. Because I'm evaluating, I remember when I was doing my mini viva for the confirmation process, and then one of the panelists asked a question and said, what exactly are you trying to achieve by evaluating? Are you aware that the model you must use must be able to test whatever it is you're trying to test for? So that was when I came to understand that, okay, if I'm doing an evaluation, whatever model I'm going to use must be connected to that. So it's like there is a system. If I'm evaluating it, I just want to know what could be done differently, what is on ground already, and what can be done again, probably to change that system. Thank you.
Thank you. I think both of those responses are really interesting, and there's so many things I want to pick up on. Thinking about these sort of points we picked out, then with like the definition of it. So we had looking to value something against a set system or agreed upon values or priorities. And we had like looking at like the what and the where and the how and the when. I think those are all highly relevant in evaluation, but I think there's also other spaces we can explore with evaluation. So something that lots of evaluators look at is learning and what we can like learn from a process, but also what people involved in that process can learn from it. And this sort of relates back to these issues of equitability and equality. So who can we involve in that process of evaluation? So it might be within your own research that you're conducting, and if you are doing some evaluative work, you think, actually, who am I involving in that process? And particularly if you're looking at these spaces where you're interested in equitability, which is, you know, something that we can see is highly not necessarily popular but prominent in sociological research. That might be something as well to bring into the conversation. Like my background and my work is around a theory of creative evaluation, where we draw theories from creative methods, creative methodologies, creative thinking, and use those in evaluation approaches. And that's really to prioritize equitable practices. They often tend to be approaches that are highly participatory, they're often co-designed approaches. And when we say creative, we're not talking about doing artistic things. Sometimes it can include those in the activities, but it's about thinking creatively about evaluation and doing things sometimes differently from the mainstream, or embedding evaluation approaches that are deeply contextual into your work. So I think those are all things that could also be really interesting in the digital space. And I think this isn't something that's just a problem for people working in the digital sectors. It's a problem like widely with evaluation, and widely like the things we struggle with as researchers is how we establish the impact. And like Ros already actually picked up on this, like it's you guys are being asked to do extra things now to think about the impact of your work. And that wasn't necessarily like something that was as common to do before. And it might have been something that lecturers or, you know, people higher up in the chain would be asked to report back for things like the REF, which you may or may not have heard of. And there's also things like the TEF and the KEF, because we love our acronyms. So I think what we can think about with evaluation is actually how it can be helpful in understanding like the dimensions of good. Because it's about establishing something. So it could be, you know, at the end of a process, you want to establish what has happened, but we can also use evaluative processes for, you know, future thinking. So actually, like, how can we use this information we've collected to plan for the future? So as I'm from a design research background, I often think about what it can be used to develop new things. So when we come to create new, could be products or systems or ideas or services, how am I informing that based on what I've learned? And that's where evaluation has a lot of strengths. I've also looked at evaluation from a very developmental perspective. So there is a whole research on evaluation called developmental evaluation. And that theory is like to use evaluation throughout the process of something, which I think naturally as designers we do, because we think in iterations. We're constantly like redesigning, redoing stuff. Bless you. So I think that's also really helpful to think about in the sort of design and implementation of digital spaces. Are we evaluating this as we're going along through a process? How can evaluation help support that process to be positive? How can we bring people into that story, and when are we doing that? It's also maybe about thinking about how we're embedding evaluation into what we're doing. So sometimes people won't think about evaluation until right at the end. And that is one way to use evaluation. But could you imagine if you thought about it from the start of what you were doing, how much more, what the benefits could be of that process? So it could be that your project has more efficacy. It could be that you are including people earlier on that you actually need to include to make that process more valuable. And particularly if you're looking at these topics where you know, you want to consider like EDI, for example, you know, that could be a really powerful process. So I know evaluation often seems like a bit of an odd topic to talk about, and it's not something we naturally like maybe connect with when we're thinking about digital research. But I think it's something like really valuable, and it's really interesting seeing actually and hearing today the people that are considering it, and it is part of like a prominent part of their work. So I was really excited when I heard actually a lot of those presentations. I was like, yeah, good job, guys. Would anyone else in the audience or in the panel like to say anything about evaluation, how they've used it, how they considered it? And this is an open question for anyone here.
I was thinking, as you said, I find it quite a dry term. And, you know, I would admit my immediate reaction would be, oh gosh, you know, I'm not going down that. But I think the way you've covered it just shows how you can approach it very differently. And I really like that idea of that question, what might happen if you started with evaluation in mind? I think it is because in the academy, it does feel like death by evaluation, you know, with our various frameworks for excellence, etc. But of course, there are these much more generative ways in which we can approach evaluation. So it's really helpful to hear.
And I think there is that evaluation does have a slightly bad reputation for being like bureaucratic, for being dry, which it very often is. That's, you know, that has that reputation for a reason. But I think there are like more exciting approaches to doing evaluation, if you can use those terms together. But yeah, and that's like my body of research is looking towards those areas. So and if anyone is interested, like they can speak to me after as well, and I can show you some resources that might be helpful.
Thank you so much, Violet. Thank you for some of the comments up there. There's some really nice questions sort of being posed around evaluation and sort of trying to open it up and expand it. And I think Violet's really done a nice job with that. Can someone write down imposter syndrome and put that up there? Because Violet started off with, I don't know sort of why I've been asked to be on the panel. She's demonstrated very clearly why she should be on the panel. And I think, you know, we all have that sense in our careers, and we, you know, I don't lose that sense in particular situations of feeling that way, of like, should I really be here? So stick with it, Violet, because you're an amazing scholar. Speaking of amazing scholars, let me introduce you to Ben, who's just been, his range of work is fantastic and his range of methods are fantastic. So Ben.
Thanks so much. Hi, I'm Ben. I'm down today from Edinburgh. So my questions are, I'm going to focus mostly on methods because I think critique kind of comes into this as well, but particularly here, so what methods can and should we use to study our changing digital societies? But actually, having listened to the talks today, I think it could possibly be better phrased as what did good digital methods look like? And I think that's because we often think about, are my methods any good? Are they accurately capturing aspects of the social situation I'm studying or evaluating or whatever it might be? But obviously that word kind of has two meanings there. It's not just about whether it's producing an accurate account, whatever that might mean, but the other commitments that we have alongside methods as well, which are often ethical commitments. And as well as ethical commitments, have I caused harm in doing the thing I'm doing? The normative baggage that we take up when we use or choose a particular method, and the kind of, I guess you might more broadly say the epistemic baggage as well. So what sort of picture of the world does a particular method give? And what does that mean in the particular context that I'm looking at? So I've got a couple of disciplinary homes, but I'm primarily a criminologist. So for us, these questions become particularly sharp, I think often because the knowledge you produce, the sort of background assumptions about society that you can embed in your methods can often be quite harmful without you realizing it, even if you think you've done a sort of ethically sound study. Actually, just the whole way you framed the questions, the groups you've chosen to look at, the power of the academy focusing on particular topics can itself really actually cause second, third, fourth order forms of harm that it's often quite difficult to think about when you're in the moment of choosing your methods. And this is why, so I often get quite grumbly about this, but I think we often focus too much on method as method. So as a particular set of research skills that we're teaching. Can you code up an R program? Can you analyze a piece of text? Can you do a statistical regression? And we often don't really tell people much about, well, where does this method actually come from? What was it originally invented to do? What theories are built in to how this method works? And I remember seeing a really good presentation by Professor David Garland, who's a criminologist from New York University, but also from Edinburgh. And he said, well, you know, a lot of these methods have got essentially metaphors for society built into them. So some methods, particularly statistical methods, see society as big social structures that we're trying to sort of measure through these different accounts, or processes, engines that are out there generating social phenomena. And that takes with it a certain sense of particular focuses and moral values as well. Other methods talk about society as a game or a dance or a play or a performance. And so they focus on aspects of interpersonal communication, the signals we give off, these kind of things. And that itself embeds a really compelling and morally loaded set of rhetorics and logics about society. So I think it's important to think when we're choosing methods and we're employing methods about the broader baggage we're bringing with us. So this is also, I have to say, the easiest brief out of the briefs everyone else has given, because it's going to be hopefully the easiest one to sort of invite you all to speak about, because everyone's worried about methods. I remember agonizing about methods as a PhD student. And also we all use methods, even if we're just doing desk-based research. That is a form of methods in itself, and we make choices about it. So by way of asking you some questions about your research, I'll do the thing which academics always do, which is to talk about their own career. So my first experience, so my first degree was in chemistry. I did a master's degree in chemistry at Edinburgh, which is a weird thing to do. I completely appreciate. And throughout that process, I was learning a lot of statistics and mathematics. And as I was doing that, I also got heavily involved in LGBT activism. And so I really wanted to move into sort of studying society. So the first kind of big job I got after my master's was working as a statistician for the Scottish Government. So the way we kind of generated data about society was through administrative data, through big, large-scale surveys. And it's interesting because the sort of statistics you do in government aren't really the same as the sort of statistics necessarily we do in the academy. These statistics are less about thinking about social structure and moving big blocks of society around. It tends to be about administration. How do we actually collect information about a process and make it run better? There's not a lot of room in there for necessarily challenging the foundations of how those processes run. So I'd be interested to know, because this is one of the methods people really worry about. Does anyone, who here is using statistical methods or quantitative methods? Got one, two, yeah, I got loads. See, you were shy about it though, because it's yes. So, and would you describe yourself, of the people who do, who talks about themselves as a quantitative person? Some people don't, some people do. And I think this is another interesting aspect, that some forms of methods sometimes can become quite core parts of our identity as researchers, which is one of the reasons why I'm quite an odd researcher, because I've done bits and pieces of everything. But I do still secretly think of myself as a bit of a quantitative person. And Stato. So I'd be interested to know, would anyone like to talk about why you decided to do statistical methods for your research?
So I basically use computational models like large language models to predict sexism. So I want to use that first of all because the data is huge and there's no way that I can qualitatively approach that. So I'm basically using the qualitative approaches and what they derive from there to computationally implement that. So that is one of the reasons why. And statistical method is basically to confirm the hypothesis to see if this kind of changes or this kind of differences are actually significant or not in the population. So those are the reasons why.
So a great answer. So you're doing it the right way around, because usually we teach people that, you know, you have a set of research problem and then you create a set of questions and then you select a method that's appropriate to answering your particular research questions. Now, actually very few people do this. What usually happens is people think, oh, I'd quite like to do an ethnography and I need an ethnographic field site now, which is what I did. So that was my PhD. So I, when I went to do a PhD in criminology, but essentially sociology of crime and deviance. And I turned up with a bunch of theoretical ideas about actor network theory that I wanted to do some theory stuff with initially in my proposal. And my supervisor said, are you really interested in this? And I said, not really, I'd quite like to do an ethnography, please. And so they said, yeah, we'll need a field site. But I think that's another example of how really actually these commitments are often about like what sort of work we want to do, what we actually want to spend our time doing. And you'll find that with the PhD as well. You know, it's quite a large chunk of your life. And so it's useful to choose a particular type of thing, a type of practice, a type of work that you're going to enjoy and be excited about doing over that period. So in terms of what my ethnography looked like, I did an ethnographic study of a big organization called the Tor Project, a technical organization that builds anonymity and encryption tools. And what that involved was a set of methodological choices coming actually from Susan Lee Starr, who says, you know, rather than counterposing the sociology of Bruno Latour, where you speak to the boss and the head scientist and the politician first, well, Susan Lee Starr said, well, bring in a lot of theory from feminist theory, you know, actually speak to the janitors, the maintainers, you know, the people who are doing the work that no one cares about, and you should care about it. So that's what I did. I worked from the outside in. I spoke to apparently the least important people in the network, and then I finally got an interview with the head of the organization, I think 2 weeks before the final chapter of my book off, which is often how it works. But that, as you can see, is both a methodological commitment. You produce different sources of data by selecting different field sites, but it's also a moral commitment and a normative one. What was interesting there was, when I did this big ethnographic study, I wrote it up, and I got this big sort of oceans of discourse. So I had all these different groups and what their discourses were and what they saw in the world and how they believed the world worked. And I tried to turn that into a book. It made, I think, a decent PhD. Tried to turn it into a book, and I thought, this is the most boring thing I've ever read in my life. Who cares? Because there's no time, there's no space, there's no action, there's no characters, there's no story. And so I had to actually draw on very different analytical methodologies and theories to bring out actually, well, why should anyone care about this? How do we actually bring that stuff out into a narrative? And so there's also questions about the purpose of our research and the types of methods we might select. So I'll just finish very quickly by talking about computational methods. So actually I have one of my colleagues here today from the Computational Methods Center I worked at for my postdoc, who I won't embarrass, except she's laughing. But yeah, so I went, after my PhD, I went to work at the Cambridge Cybercrime Center, where I specialized largely in digital methods and computational methods. We essentially scraped large amounts of data from cybercrime forums and subjected it to a lot of kind of machine learning analysis. And as someone who trained as an ethnographer and a statistician, but also had done some programming, I found initially this quite unsatisfying. So who here does we've got one person who does computational methods, but any other sort of ML, NLP sort of modeling text and speech people? That's interesting. So has anyone ever seen the outputs of one of those when you do sort of machine learning modeling of big text corpuses? Who's ever seen one that really convinced them of a sort of sociological finding? So there is really good research in this field. This is not me just sort of slagging off all of computational social science, which I'm not. But I think what often happens when you immediately produce an output of one of these things is you get a bag of text, a huge bag of text, the size of an ocean, and the ML, the machine learning, basically divvies it up into some topics, or it gives you a network diagram, or it gives you something like that. And so you do a paper and you say, well, look at my bag of topics. These are the 5 most important words in that topic. And here's my little spidery network diagram. And then someone says, well, yeah, on you go. And that's kind of it. You don't have anything to say. And so it can often, I think, produce quite a thin rendering of social life when you just use them in isolation. And so one of the things we did at the center was to actually bring lots and lots of different people together. So machine learning experts, psychologists, sociologists, criminologists, pure technical people, all sorts of different people, to get them to work together on these problems. And one of the things that we found was that by iterating between different methods, sort of dancing between lots of different approaches, trying to tie them together with theory, actually working together on a lot of this stuff, that was able to produce quite convincing descriptive and kind of narrative accounts of real social problems we were looking at. And this made me think about what you were saying, particularly Ros, you mentioned, well, you know, I've kind of, some of the things we have to do if we want to have an impact on the world aren't necessarily things we've personally been trained to do, right? To actually go out and maybe build something, right? Or do something else. And I think it's something that we kind of, it's part of the structure of the PhD that's slightly unfortunate, is that we often tell people that it's about becoming this solo heroic person, researcher that can kind of do everything and should be a master of all methods that they need to use and able to do everything they need to do for their project. Whereas actually, it's really, research is often much more collaborative. Even if you're doing solo desk-based research, theory research, you'll be in conversation with other people all the time. You'll be exploring ideas with other people. You may find actually that some of the stuff that you produce is extremely useful to people doing methods that you might consider totally inimical to what you're doing. So we found, for example, our ethnographers were really useful to the computer scientists because they could say, well, okay, actually, you've got all this big model of data here, but that's quite clearly just people joking around. It's nothing to do with crime or anything. So you can just remove that because they actually understood the communities in a very deep and rich way that they were investigating. So, and that also goes on to impact. So when you actually have, you don't necessarily have to do everything yourself. And I think as a PhD student, one of the things I found most useful and most empowering was actually being part of a community and really sort of trying to help other people out, work with other people, share ideas, share methods, develop these communal accounts and a communal social world that can be one of the most powerful things I think we do. And I think it's good. But yeah, so I think I've kind of rambled too much, but thank you very much. I'll pass. Actually, you've got one.
I've got one. Thank you, Ben. I mean, I think that question of methods is so important, and the way. So many of you who are probably embarking on your PhD might be choosing a method or feel comfortable with a method, but I think what Ben speaks to and various social sciences more broadly is this mixture of methods. And I think someone might be from, is it Cynthia, who's at the Center for Interdisciplinary Methods at Warwick? So there are centers and institutes that are really trying to bring together methods in innovative ways. So as you embark and carry on with the journey of your PhDs, think about the way in which methods may sort of intersect with one another and create a kind of more expansive way of understanding your problem, your research problem. So who would say here that they deal with the question of the global flows of labor in their research, in their PhDs?
Hands high in the air.
Yes. One of you. Can we have a mic over there? What's your area of study? Yeah. You put yourself on the spot now.
Hi, my name is Abel. Yeah, I've been researching Uber since 2018 now, from different perspectives. So
yeah.
And mostly in Brazil, so a bit of comparison. Europe, US, and Latin America.
Yeah, so the work that you do is on Uber in Latin America and Brazil. And of course, absolutely, because you've got the sort of gig economy as a sort of global platform that then intersects with the specificity of Brazil in a place that obviously is unique in its sort of global position. This is precisely the area of study that intrigues me. And it intrigues me for a whole range of reasons, from the exploitation of labor that feeds into a capitalist project, which the tech sector, of course, is built on top of, but also because it's a methodological question of how do we deal with scale? And I'm sure you've been, how do you move from talking to an individual, talking to a gig worker, talking to someone who might work in management at Uber, for example, and at the same time speak across a set of global questions? And for those of you who haven't read Anna Singh, you must read Anna Singh. She's written a beautiful book, The Mushroom at the End of the World. She's also written some various ethnographies, one of which is called Frictions. What she does as an ethnographer, I'm still trying to get my head around and sort of replicate in various ways, but she is able to write about specificity, but also talk about the global at the same time. And so for an ethnographer, that is an astounding achievement. I just wanted to give you a sort of example of this in my own work. So who of you have come across the idea of data annotation in machine learning and artificial intelligence? A few of you. So the big secret behind AI, of course, is it's a myth. That much of the AI that we use requires human labor to train these models, not just at the beginning of the pipeline, but throughout the pipeline. When you use generative AI, when you use ChatGPT, it is relying on the manual annotation of data to train models and to keep those models from being toxic or harmful. And that you may have seen coverage of this. There's been various popular press coverage of this in the media. So part of my research is to study that data annotation labor. Myself and an amazing PhD student that I work with, Shravya, has been studying data annotation in India, but it also goes on in South America and Latin America and parts of Africa. and parts of Asia as well. This is a platformed work that is originally started off in places like Amazon Mechanical Turk, so it was really distributed, but now has been centralized through third-party companies that respond to vendor requests from the likes of Google, Microsoft, etc. So what happens is Google may have, or let's say OpenAI has managed to aggregate some kind of data set, and they will design this data set or aggregate this data set in such a way that they can ship it to somewhere in, let's just say, India to be labeled. So I've been involved in some of this work as an ethnographic exercise where I worked with some colleagues at Google who were putting together a data set on the harms in large language models. And I guess the eventual aim there was to, can we reduce the kind of harmful language that these large language models perpetuate? I don't really think that works, to be honest, but let's put that to one side for a moment. If you think about the flows of capital and knowledge, and I think you mentioned, was it Kat, that you mentioned sort of questions of coloniality in AI, the patterns and roots of the colonial flows of knowledge and wealth and power are being replicated and amplified. Not precisely, we have to think a little bit broadly about that, but it gives us, when we start to think about the specific within these global flows, we start to see trends and patterns that we need to ask ourselves questions about in terms of power and authority. And what constitutes good? Because actually these systems are built on really worrying and troubling premises of power and inequity and the exploitations of labor, of course. So of course, what happens in this flow of data sets is that we are projecting a notion of what normative assessments of good are in language. Because whose good are we talking about when we ask someone in India to label something as harmful or not? The likelihood is we're talking about a global north version of good, and more specifically, a Silicon Valley version of good. And that's, of course, I'm oversimplifying, but I think we have these sort of ideas of flow and directions of knowledge and power and authority being amplified and intensified through these kind of ways in which information and knowledge travel. So some of my work has been involved in how do we rethink that relationship between those people who annotate and label data, so they may have more agency, and so they may actually have a greater say over what constitutes good within these large language models. It's a really difficult, it's one of these situations where you feel like there's something you can do, but that thing that you do just feeds more into the kind of architecture that is already exploitating and sort of reducing language to some sort of very reductive framework. And so it's a really, I don't have easy answers to what we do with this, but I think it's a project that really needs to be unraveled. And I think I just wanted to kind of give you an example of the way in which we might think about the global, but also situate it within very specific case studies that we can, it's fantastic that you're doing that work. And there's some amazing work in that area as well around, I have a friend and colleague who's looking at data annotation in Latin America as well, so it's happening there. We're sort of running out of time. I guess this is sort of maybe something we can ponder on together. So who's had some encounter with generosity in their PhDs? Okay, and I'm saying that purposefully in a very open-ended way. Would you like to explain what encounter you've had? And
I don't know, in many ways, I think in the community, I believe like talking to other PhDs, people that offer their time. I think that's the thing for me, the most generous things, people giving up their time to talk to us, to listen to us. So I think that for me, I feel very time poor in general. So whenever someone has time for me, I find that quite generous.
Thank you. Any other experiences or encounters with generosity?
Yeah, just building on that as well, I think also being generous with research participants. And I think particularly for those of us who work on, like myself, like kind of our research participants being from kind of marginalized communities where a lot of their intellectual time and labor is being kind of capitalized on by researchers without any kind of reciprocity being seen there. I think that was something that I was very cognizant of when doing my work and thinking very seriously about what reciprocity looks like for people who were giving me, say, 2 or 3 hours of their time for a research interview. You know, what are the ways in which I can be generous and reciprocal there as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else have any additions to that? Oh, over here. Could we have the mic over here?
My experience encountering generosity is very similar to Tanvi. The most generous things that I have encountered is from my research subject and my interviewees. They're mostly from marginalized communities, and they're very willing to be seen and heard. So they are often very open to share everything they have with me. But that also makes me nervous and anxious. Like, am I doing it in a reciprocal way? Or am I just harvesting their efforts to do my research? So I'm really grateful for their generosity, but I feel more burdened with their generosity. But I do think that's a good thing to keep me anxious about that.
Yeah, that's a really nice point. And you've all sort of echoed this, is that as researchers, we expect so much from our participants and those involved in our research and our colleagues. And how do we make sure that we are open to some sort of reciprocal relationship? So I've been thinking about generosity a lot, probably, I think, in the last, 5 years or so, as I increasingly become a senior academic, which is a worrying thought. And while we are taught so often in our research to think about things like neutrality and objectivity, we're so rarely taught to be affective, to have some emotional encounter with our colleagues, with our field sites. And of course, many of us will encounter research environments that Ros sort of touched on that don't feel generous at all. That in fact, quite the opposite. And they may be individuals, they may be the way in which a culture has been configured over time to be unreciprocal. And I feel like I came from a sociology that was of that kind, that was about largely men asserting their knowledge and experience on others and making others feel bad for not knowing things. And it took me a while as an academic to realize that that was not really the only way to do academia. That there were collectives of people and scholars, very often feminist collectives within the academy that were radically different and opposed to that kind of scholarship. And so one of the things that I've come to think about that kind of captures some of those places and that I have sought out and that I have spent time with, and I've, if you like, interviewed those people who set up those places, just to sort of get a sense of how those places came to be the places they are, was central to those was this idea of generosity. And by that, I mean all the things that you've touched on. So of course, generosity in what your participants offer you, generosity in the field site, but also a generosity amongst each other. And I guess this is the really big kind of maybe closing remark from me is how do we sustain that generosity amongst each other? How do we navigate an academic and research environment that sometimes isn't that way, and particularly when you're early career researchers and PhD students like yourselves, when we don't lack the sort of authority and power to necessarily have that kind of impact on research environments. So I suppose my feeling here is that you need to find the right people. And sometimes you don't always have that choice. Sometimes you find yourself in settings that don't allow for that. And we just have to kind of bear it for a little while, but find other collectives that you can kind of tap into. And this is one of them. And they will sustain you. And then as you increasingly take on a role where you might be able to shape these things in small ways, they might be through seminar series, they might be through reading groups, they might eventually be through running a research group or a center or an institute. And is how do you foster that sort of sense of generosity amongst each other? And that, if you like, has been sort of my career path, and probably the last 10 years has been thinking, how do we create these environments where people feel like they can flourish? And what kinds of methods and techniques do we put into place that allow for that? And I think increasingly there are academics who are working in those ways because of this general awareness that the research environment is so formative to our practice as scholars. So I will always hold myself, my hand out and say, I will be open to those discussions with people like yourselves who may feel like you need that support, or those directions that you might want to get pointed into where sort of generative practice takes place, where generous practice takes place. So again, if you want to get in touch with me about that, I'd be happy to. Also, of course, topically, my interest is in, as I've said, this kind of computational technological layer to our social lives. For the most part, that's around AI at the moment for me. Again, I'm really happy to kind of respond to questions and thoughts about that, either, well, probably offline at this stage of the day. We're kind of at time, but I don't know if there's 5 minutes or something, and I don't know how we wanted to take just general questions.
Well, if people have got time, we can just do 1 or 2 questions.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, this is kind of to everyone, but it kind of came up when I think Ben was speaking. I wondered what you think the role of translation is in, this kind of interdisciplinary, multidiscipline work that we're all like eager to do, and whether there is a need for, we have enough people who are translators and whose role it actually is, who are kind of paid up, like researchers or like academics who, I think doing kind of actually similar stuff to what it sounds like Ros is doing, but like, bringing together and convening and like bringing people together in ways they might not have identified for themselves, if that makes sense. Because I think we recognize you can't be a master of all methods and so on. So there's a kind of need for that like meta expertise maybe. So anyone really on that.
So I completely agree. I think that's vital, both in terms of running research groups and actually doing good research, but also in translating the outputs of those research processes into things that actually do have an impact in the world, actually taking that knowledge and putting it into something. So in the group I was working at, but also in a lot of other work I've done, I think that particular type of role is really important, of the translator, of someone who is able to have a bit of a foot in lots of different camps. And I think particularly seeing here today how many people with such different ways of approaching the social and different methods and ideas and topics and orientations, I think it really just to show how successful that can be if it's done well. But I think that there is often what we often think of is this, again, we start to reconstruct a hero and we say, oh, well, what we need is this hero translator now, who's going to buzz around between all the different groups and do all that sort of stuff. Whereas actually, I think if you're in one of these big interdisciplinary settings, I think you all have to do the translation work. And the big thing there is, I think the key thing that makes it, because I've seen it work and I've seen it not work. The key thing is epistemic humility, not to try to say, well, my discipline's the best one and everyone else is my client that will provide the nice little outputs, whether that's your users of your tech who you're trying to get their knowledge, or whether it's the other people researching the thing you're researching together. It's actually valuing each other's contributions and making an attempt to learn a little bit of one another's languages and actually what they value in the research they're doing, and to see that value as well. It doesn't mean we can't criticize each other, obviously. But yeah, so I think it's a difficult thing to navigate, but I think it's incredibly powerful when it does work. So yes, absolutely.
I'm thinking about translation a lot right now, and I guess I know this is not the kind of translation you're referring to, but maybe I can try and come back to that. So if we think about global flows and the way Anna Singh talks about them in her writing, she talks about this requirement of a translation from what she calls peri-capitalism, a capitalism that doesn't fit the logics of capitalism as we know it, into this kind of this global amorphous idea of capitalism, and the requirement of translation from one to the other, a continual sort of shifting and moving between the two. And I guess the point there for me, in answer to your question, is that translation has these normative effects as well, that by doing the translation work, sometimes we are doing structural work that we may not be necessarily paying attention to. And so I think the work of translation requires thought in and of itself in terms of what kinds of structures are we intensifying here, even when the intent is good about communicating science and knowledge. Sometimes we're doing things that we may not have intended to do. So translation is really exciting in our work, I think, but that requires thought as well. Everything requires thought. It's thinking all the way down, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Hi, so can you hear me? You still can't hear me? Okay. So thanks, everyone. Great, presentations, as I knew they would be. So this is a question that I actually asked in the last keynote, which was in the showcase, but I was sort of wanted to repeat it here because I want to hear your thoughts on this. So in the last keynote, and actually Ros sort of showed some of these slides this morning, the presenter showed like all of these different this slide with all of these different terms on that were like, AI for good, drones for good, just everything for good. It almost looked like this sort of graveyard of the things for good. And the thing that keeps me up at night is thinking, how do we avoid just becoming digital good, adding to that graveyard in the future? And I think part of it's about sort of creating this environment that does this fostering. And I think two of the attributes that I've taken from this today is like this idea of generosity and that sort of humility there, like actually being able to sort of do some of that translational work, feel like really important ingredients to that. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about other things we need to do to sort of avoid that graveyard.
Okay, so I think the Digital Good Network sets out to do a great deal. And I will be honest, it probably won't achieve all of those things to the level we promise our funder, which is true of all research, that you don't quite hit every nail on the head. Some nails you hit much further down into the wood. I've taken the wood bit far too far now. But the idea for me is that a few of the things that I have learned from the Digital Good Network, I will take forward. Okay, so to me, it would be unacceptable for us to think about generating any kind of space like this. I've been to these sort of spaces before where I felt like a sore thumb. It is horrible, but to move into a space where you feel included, it is not all that common in academia. And certainly the last time we ran this, some of the students who came, I've never been to a space like this before, where it's okay to talk about gender neutral toilets or to think about reflexively about how I am a generous researcher with my participants. Like these are not the things we really talk about in the space I come from. So if anything, if there's one thing that's fostered through the Digital Good Network that has some longevity beyond it, it is those more modest practices. But those practices, they sort of, I think, sediment into hopefully a disciplinary perspective and set of practices that we then reproduce. How we, like one day, all of you will have PhD students, or many of you will, and I hope that you treat them with the kind of generosity of spirit that Alex is talking about, right? So that's one thing. Whether we generate technologies for good, Dan, is quite another conversation. And I feel like we've got still time to do it. There is, of course, always that risk. I hope that we push the conversation forward, but I think about the discipline I am in and that others in the panel are in, sociology. The conversation is that I've never had conversations that have gotten as far as it has been for me being in the Digital Good Network. I've never started to talk about these things in the way I have in the last 2 years. So I feel as though for some of us, the stuff we're talking about here might be less mind-blowing. For others of us, it's like, whoa, you know, these are conversations I've never had before. And I think it's important to bear in mind that what's like, yeah, of course, run of the mill is actually quite extraordinary for other people. And bearing in mind that interdisciplinary makeup of us is really important. So will we end up in the graveyard? Eventually in 2026, the Digital Good Network will cease to exist. We will stop running summer schools. We will stop funding research. Something might exist in its stead, and we probably will apply to turn this into something even bigger than it currently is, because the universities have a voracious appetite to bring in research funding, and we will be compelled to do that. But it's also something that we want to do as well, isn't it? So I don't know. I hope we don't end up in a graveyard, though. That's quite a maudlin way of ending the day, isn't it, if we do? So at least we're going to end up in a nice restaurant tonight.
I might quickly jump in on that one. So in terms of building stuff, I think we often think when we're talking about big academic projects that, you know, you're going to lay down some of the sort of fundamental infrastructure for the next wave of society, or be like another big Google, but actually this time really don't be evil, right? But I and some of my colleagues spend quite a lot of time doing research at hacker and maker festivals and camps. And it's quite amazing to see what people can actually do, create over the course of a weekend or a long week, and then completely destroy at the end of it as well. And so I think those are some of the most amazing and utopian and imaginative and actually things that have had a lot of impact beyond just those spaces. But I think it sometimes, yeah, ended up in the graveyard's not always the least hopeful destination, I think.
Yeah, like my main thought when I heard that question, Dan, was actually about complacency. And this is not necessarily something just relevant to the DGN, but like us as researchers to just not become complacent. And I think that's like when people end up in places like a graveyard, because it's that complacency of not critiquing yourself, not being reflexive as a researcher. And I think if, you know, we're looking at how we can move into capturing digital good, how we can make sure our practices are good practices, that's what we need to maybe have as like an integral part of our processes, being reflexive, as well as embodying those things like generosity. Yeah.
Okay, I think we should probably wrap up there, but I think the thing I have seen so much of today is generosity and reflexivity amongst you. So I'm just so proud of you and excited to see how, you know, the directions you take your work in. So thank you for sharing with us earlier today.
Could I just say a huge thanks, Alex, for leading us all with this. It's been amazing learning about your work and you guiding us through this conversation. Can I also just say a massive thank you to Daniel, our tech bod, who brings this owl every time we have one of these. Nothing would work in this building without Daniel. Thank you. And Ruth, Nikki, Sarah, I think she may have headed off, and Xiaoying and Arathi for helping to do all of this. Laura, our wonderful photographer.